Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all found your sweaters overnight and are settling in for what is now really a fall afternoon here. I'm Amherst Williams. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut League of History Organizations, and we're so happy to have you here with us today in the second of our newspaper digitization webinar series, brought to you through us and the Connecticut State Library through a collaboration with Connecticut Humanities. In this second webinar, we're going to be digging more into the questions about copyright and permissions. And we have with us today Hope O'Keefe, who's Senior Associate General Counsel at the Library of Congress. And again, with us, we have Nicole Besseghir, who's the project coordinator for the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project, and Anna Newman, the co-director of the Digital Newspaper Project at the Connecticut State Library. Also here with me from CLHO is our wonderful membership and programs manager, Emily Garfinkel, who will be recording today. We'll follow up with you via email with information, link to the slides, other resources that came up during the webinar, and a link to the recording, of course. So that will also be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. Stay muted unless you have a question. General Zoom etiquette rules apply. If you have questions as we go, please pop them in the chat. Emily and Nicole and I will all be and maybe Anna too, will be keeping an eye on that as we go. If anything seems super urgent and timely, we can pop in and pepper Nicole and Hope with it. And yeah, well, I imagine that we'll have some time at the end for questions, of which I'm sure there will be many, because copyright always generates so many questions, right? Super confusing topic. Without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Nicole and Hope and put myself on mute here. Take it away, ladies.
All right, Hope is going to start us off. So hi again, I'm Nicole Besseghir from the Connecticut State Library. I am the project coordinator for the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project. And Hope O'Keefe, as Emma said, is from the Library of Congress, and she advises obviously the Library of Congress on copyright issues, and she speaks to National Digital Newspaper Program awardees frequently about newspaper copyright. And so she has graciously come today to share her knowledge with us. So I'm going to let her start. She's going to speak for a bit, and then I will speak a little bit after she's done, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So take it away, Hope.
Hey, y'all. Glad to be at least virtually back in Connecticut. I went to high school there, so it's been a minute, but I was really excited to get this invitation. I'm going to share my screen, not to bore you with death by copyright, but because this is complex and nasty stuff, and I want to. I think the words help, and I assume that the PowerPoints will be available later as well. But please, I love playing Stump the Lawyer if you have hard questions, and if I haven't done my job right and you've got basic questions, I am, there are no stupid questions either, so I invite both kinds. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll talk in a bit. Looking for my display options. I think you have it right. Okay, so we're basically talking about rights issues for historic newspapers. History is the funny thing about newspapers is last week becomes historical. Traditionally you take your newspapers and the next day you're wrapping your fish in them, and so that's. You end up really, history in newspapers is all about recontextualizing. This is here, I chose this image to show both my newspaper bona fides, because this is from I was a reporter for my junior high school newspaper, and this was right there. I was also a library worker at the time, so I come by this job. This is my dream job, what I'm doing now. And almost all of the images here are from Connecticut newspapers in Chronicling America. You're going to hear a lot from me about dates. And the reason why we're talking about dates is because whether or not something is copyrighted depends on its age. And one of the entertaining things, and something that we adopted in Chronicling America a few years back, we used to stop Chronicling America, which is historic newspapers. We used to stop them in 1923. Basically, we stopped them when at the point where newspapers were 95 years old, because 95 years in the United States is a magic date at which newspapers automatically go into what we call the public domain, which means they are free for anybody to use or reuse. I discovered around that time, I read somewhere that most newspapers didn't renew for copyright. Before 1976, you were required to renew for copyright. And what that meant is the possibility of a huge explosion in what we could make available through Chron-Am and the National Digital Newspaper Collection. And this is one of the things I'm proudest of in my legal career, is figuring this out, because we were able to open that huge 20th century historic gap between 1923 and 1964. Because when we found out that 90% of newspapers weren't renewing their copyrights, that meant that all of those pre-1964 newspapers went into the public domain. And that's why you'll be hearing a lot here about whether something is more than 95 years, and that split between before 1964 and after 1964. And when we get to Nicole's part of the conversation, she does the real work. I just do the theory of figuring out the timing on whether something was registered or renewed, and second, the whole messy stuff about third-party content, which I will explain in a bit. So the first test, if you've passed this first test, if you've got a really old newspaper, if it's more than 95 years old, then you know that it's completely free to use and reuse. So this 1909 copy of the Norwich Bulletin is completely free to use or reuse. And it's calculated as of January 1st of the year. So you wouldn't look at a March newspaper as being in the public domain. You'd look at it as of January 1st of the following year, so that the magic date magically becomes 1927, starting as of this coming January. So if it's published before 1964, it needs both to have been originally registered, and most newspapers were registered, not all of them, and it had to have been renewed after the term of copyright, the first term of copyright ended, which is a 28-year term. If it's published after 1964, it's going to automatically be in copyright, and it's in copyright for now the full term of copyright of since it's a corporate copyright, it's going to be a full term of 95 years. There's a slight caveat there. If they didn't use the magic signal, the C with the circle around it and the date, then it didn't have what was called copyright notice, and that also would be in the public domain. But that's a pure technicality and very, very uncommon for newspapers. So that's not typically going to be a factor in most newspapers. So if it's pre-64, and again, Nicole is going to walk you through this process, you're going to check for registration. So this is a 1946 newspaper, so it's not necessarily in the public domain, this Hartford Chronicle. So you're going to look and see. You don't have to actually check for registration necessarily. All you need to do is check for renewal. And I don't know whether Nicole will tell you whether their practice is to check for both. Because if it wasn't registered, it couldn't be renewed either. It had to have been registered. So you go to the database, check and see if it was renewed. If it was renewed, you're going to need to seek some kind of permission. And frankly, permissions are going to be easier to get for small local newspapers that aren't owned by big conglomerates. If it's a true local newspaper, I wouldn't bother if it's a big conglomerate. But again, the magic of that 64 date, if it was not both registered and renewed, it's going to be in the public domain. But there's a caveat. If the newspaper as a whole was still in the public domain, it's going to have very likely some third-party content. So third-party content might be separately copyrighted. And again, that would need to be both registered and renewed. There's a lot of syndicated content. Some of it was renewed or registered, some of it was not. Comics in particular, and I can point out King features. I can put the ones who won't surprise you are the comics that are still in existence. But some of those old comics, they're still selling the posters. They're probably still selling movie rights. So that's oddly enough the area that makes us most nervous, but also op-eds. A lot of older newspapers publish poetry, publish syndicated stories. You've probably all heard the stories. Some of the early U.S. copyrights were syndicating novels. Dickens would syndicate his novels in newspapers, and you talk about riot. You can read about the riots on the docks in New York, saying, "What happened with little Nell?" So that is not something that newspapers do anymore, but particularly for historic newspapers, it's very, very important. The newspaper article, but even the news articles might have been written by freelance reporters. In the early days, in the historical times, basically pre-1976, when the law changed, work by freelancers was almost, or freelance reporters as opposed to photographers, was almost definitely what we called work for hire, which meant that, again, that the newspaper owned it. And if the reporters or the photographers were staff photographers, then the newspaper owned it. But you're starting to see the levels of complication. And advertisements like this, this probably wasn't copyrighted. I can't look at it close. I can't see it closely enough to see whether it was, but particularly if they use national advertising, that may well have been copyrighted, and it may also have been trademarked. Trademark is a whole nother situation. We probably don't have to worry about trademark because we're not technically selling milk here. So we're not creating any confusion in our use of the trademark, and we're not really doing things competitively. So what happens with this third-party content, and Nicole will talk to you about, and this is all a matter of risk assessment. You're not going to look at every photograph. You're not going to look at every comic or every advertisement. You're going to do a reasonable, at least what I advise people, have suggested that people do. Every organization has its own standards, but typically you're going to do some kind of sampling of how much third-party content is. If a newspaper is completely syndicated, there's going to be a higher risk. If a lot of it is local, it's going to be a much lower risk, and that's going to be a decision that you and you are going to be making. But if there's third-party content, then you start looking at a doctrine called fair use, and we'll talk about that next. I do want to talk about the newspaper compilation copyright has gone several times to the 11th Circuit. Sorry, it might be the 5th Circuit. No, it's 11th, over a photographer who was cranky because he did a lot of work for National Geographic. That was his copyright. So it came within the compilation copyright, but he was arguing that when they digitized it and sold it, it wasn't it was an infringement of his copyright. And so that got very complicated. And most of what we try to do is we digitize, at least in Chron-Am, the National Digital Newspaper, we're digitizing the entire newspaper. And so we have that compilation at the same time that clippings have gotten a whole lot easier as technology gets better. So that's another factor. So fair use. It's part of the law now. It was developed by courts, and in 1976 it was added to the law. These are the four basic factors. There's preamble language and there's lots of court interpretations. So the first factor is going to be the nature of the use. This is the most important factor. It's how are we using it? Are we creating as a substitute for the original, or do we have a new and different a different use? Our use as libraries, as historic organizations, as humanities organizations is for that transformational use. We're using it for historic research. We're using it to see how people in 1883, again, this particular newspaper would be free to use and reuse in its entirety because it's in the public domain. How folks in Stafford Springs in 1883 were looking at the world, how the news is reported, what are the biases, how does it reflect the society of that time? That's not what the newspaper was published for. That's what we're using it for. And an argument is that use is transformational, that our use is historical. Again, this is no longer news of the day. So that's that fair use for all the work that we do, or rather that y'all do, with newspaper digitization is going to weigh in favor of this transformational use, even if it's including some of those comics. Because if you look at Theodore Geisel, best known as Dr. Seuss, if you look at his comics were very, very widely published during World War II. And it showed how Americans were thinking about the war. It showed some of the war propaganda about Japanese, about Germans. And it's very transformational. Or even, I know what particular comics were considered of interest to Connecticut citizens in the 40s and the 50s. It has a different use than the do we really think that the dog patch was of interest, that kind of thing. The nature of the work, that's whether it's published or not. In these cases, it's in newspapers. They're obviously published. But its main question is this a creative work or a factual work? It's going to be some of both, particularly in the days when you had lots of poetry. There are certainly photographs are very much a mix of the creative and the factual, and news reporting as well. Never mind getting when you get to the editorials page. It's a mixed. It's going to be a mixture, but it's the edges on the factual side, and because that edge is on the factual side, that probably weighs somewhat towards finding things are fair use. Again, depending on if the comics are going to be on the more creative point. So if the challenge is for that syndicated work, it might be more likely to be creative. We look at the amount work, the amount used. We are very much, we're trying to be complete. So by and large, if you're making that digitization decision, you're going to digitize the entire newspaper, because the questions of whether people are using baking powder in 1883, you start looking at how advertising worked, what the conversation was. Stafford Springs, people are actively, that was a time when you needed a piano and an organ in a middle class home. It was an important part of the way that people were educated, had access to culture. Be fascinating to look at when those advertisements disappeared. So we're looking at the whole work, and so this goes to when I talk about assessing how much of the newspaper's content is third party. That's the substantiality test that I referred to earlier. It kind of goes to the amount of the amount of risk. How much stuff is still is actively in copyright. But the amount used test has gone from, you may have heard this somewhere along the line. Oh, 10%, 10%. That's scary. There are no numbers. It's a test of reason. and and it's the test now is no longer a did you use more than X%. It's did you take more than was necessary to accomplish your purpose. And my contention would be that to accomplish the purpose of historic preservation, you need to digitize the whole thing. And then the final test, which you will still hear some courts saying this is the most important test, is the effect on the market. Will your digitize, will your copying, your fair use substitute for sale? So if you're digitizing the New York Times, which has archives going all the way back, your use is substituting for sale. And that's not, it's not going to make sense for you to do it because you can buy it for less. But you're also going directly against the sales market. And that's going to be, I think, increasingly important, both as the newspapers that are still in existence start archiving, and as you start looking at an industry that's shifting to more digital. And so if they're producing digital editions, it's not going to make as much sense for us to do this work so long as they have good archives. And that's why thinking forward to next steps as newspapers consolidate, as they go out of business, or even as they're worrying about selling the next subscription, we as memory institutions may need to work with them to think about these questions about how our great grandchildren are going to be able to access the news of our day. Anything in the chat so far before I go on? No? Good. Okay. So and that goes to the question of newspapers in existence. This is my hometown newspaper, New London Day from 10 days ago. They're now digital. So if a newspaper is still in existence, if it's in copyright, seek permission. Again, if it's an independently owned newspaper, I think the Day still is. There are people who they have roots in the community. They likely will want to work with you. Among other things, you're a source of we are sources of content for them, and they have a level of community spirit. And it's you may, I'm being naive here, but you may be able to collaborate, particularly with locally owned newspapers. You may be able to get permission if you give them a copy of scans, if they want to be building their archives. One of the wonderful things is if they've got these morgues, which are their collections of old articles and old photographs, that is a treasure trove for all of us. Not, they may or may not have full newspapers, but they almost definitely have a big file of all the photos that they've had in the past. And that's a wonderful treasure. And you may be able to establish an ongoing partnership with them, where you may become the archive for your local version of the New London Day, and you start building some of those collections. And frankly, they may be a source of funding as well. The copyright advantage here is that, as I mentioned, copyright covers those third-party newspaper materials if they're part of the compilation. So if you have permission from the newspaper to use the entire compilation, you've got the rights to the whole thing without going through all of the really messy stuff that Nicole's going to talk to you about in a bit. So it's helpful for any of the pre-1964 newspapers, and it's absolutely dispositive for the post-1964 newspapers because of this compilation rule. So that's helpful. Even if it's out of copyright, and the Day, I'm pretty sure it existed before 1964. I don't know if anybody's collected any of it. I saw someone from an East Line library on here. I don't know if there's anybody within the Day's range here. it may make sense to try that collaboration. You may get some of those same advantages, the access to the morgue and abilities to work with them on archival things, because newspapers, like the rest of us, like to think of their place in history, and what we are allowing them by the work that we do is making sure that their place in history is established, that they are not lost to history. Their legacy lives. And that's a lot of what we do is retain that legacy. Given the way that things have consolidated, odds are very good that your newspaper is no longer in existence, even if it's whether it's still in copyright because it was renewed, or it's still in copyright because it's post 1964. I mean, at this point, 1964 is still over 50 years ago and probably counts as historic in most for most of us. If it's in copyright, you've got to find some way to seek permission. That may or may not be easy. There are questions of diligent source, a diligent search to find who the corporate successor, if anyone, might be. Gotta look at, I don't, and Nicole, I don't know if you're going to talk about this at all, but working with corporate databases, trying to find the stakeholders. Some of that you can find by looking at the editorial page. It may reflect who the owners were.
Interesting. Let's do that.
I'm sorry, does someone have a question? Someone unmuted. No, okay. So we call it an orphan work if you're unable to find either to find the rights holder or identify the rights holder after you've done a reasonable good faith search. There is an argument, and you'll see it when we get to the resources page, that for us as memory institutions, it may in fact be fair use for us to present these in copyright newspapers in their entirety. I've put down that it's probably most prudent. You still want to digitize them because otherwise they're going to rot and get eaten by mice. But it might be more prudent to limit those to on-premises use or not. That's going to be a call for your institution, and it's going to depend on the size of the size of the newspaper, and whether you think there's anyone out there that is really going to care that you have done this, because your remedy is best remedy is always just, hey, I'm so very sorry, I'll take it down. Can I give you a copy? That kind of thing. It's unlikely that anybody is going to sue you if you're willing to take it down, provided you have proved that diligent search. And this all goes to the question of risk management. And the first, I think for me, I think the last point is that's on here is the most important. What is the risk to our mission as memory institutions, our mission as making this historical information available, of saving this information, of really saving these memories and these historical facts, if we don't use them and we don't make them available? We tend to think a lot more when we talk about risk. We think about, oh, is somebody going to sue us? Is somebody going to get mad? But risk goes both ways, and the risk to mission is important. So there's always going to be some risk. There may be a potential copyright. There may be a crazy person out there who digitized the same thing, and therefore they think they've got the right to it. We certainly have answered those claims here at the Library of Congress, and the answer is no. If it's, particularly if it's public domain, the fact you don't own the right just because you digitized it, that's pretty well established. But it's also, sometimes you may not have the right person, and copyright is messy. And even if you do everything right, you may face a stupid claim. And the idea is to assess what the risks are, decide what risks you want to assume, how much, and how you're going to mitigate them. The takedown that I mentioned before, the giving people credit. sometimes you can negotiate that. You know, many thanks to the great grandchildren of the owners of the bee, and sometimes when you do a notice and takedown, you want to do it in a friendly way, so that you're not just saying, oh no, is this in copyright? That's horrible. We're so very sorry. We'll take it down right away. You want to phrase it as a, if you have more information about this resource, if you know something about the bee is a bad example because it's fully public domain, but if you know something about the bee, if you know who ran it, if the family is still there in Newtown, let us know. And in fact, there was after there was a commemorative issue within the last 10 years of the bee. So there's this sense of proprietorship in our newspapers, particularly in our smaller communities. Peter Hurdle is one of the geniuses of copyright. So I love quoting Peter. So if something's in copyright, you have some pretty clear, and again, anything since 1964 is in copyright. So there's a lot of really important historical information that's in copyright. There's a lot of protection if you're just digitizing for preservation, if you're just preserving as opposed to access. Preservation and access are different considerations when you think about the legal side of things, and it makes a whole lot of sense to preserve things before they get brittle and disintegrate. If you are a library or an archive, which will certainly include many historical or historical societies, if you're open to the public and you have things that people can come look at, you're an archive. You don't have to be lending them out. Library of Congress is a non-lending library. We only lend to members of Congress and the Supreme Court, President, Vice President. So people come on premises to look at our stuff. We're more of an archive. But there's a section of copyright called Section 108. And for some reason, Section 107 is fair use. We call it fair use, but Section 108, we just call Section 108, not the Libraries and Archives exemption. Has a number of provisions that are of direct interest for memory institutions. If a newspaper is damaged, deteriorated, lost, stolen, or an obsolete format, then you are allowed to make up to 3 copies, which basically means even though given ephemerality of copies, you can scan it, you can microfilm it. If you can't obtain an unused replacement, and by and large, if there's a newspaper that's 50 years old, it's going to be pretty hard to attain an unused replacement. The limit is that a digital copy under 108, as opposed to under fair use, cannot be made available off the premises of the library. So that in terms of the three copies is a complicated question. We have at some time said that that's limited to 3 institutions because whenever you make a copy, it's sitting somewhere in your memory of your computer. When we talk about obsolete formats, microfilm, microfiche are increasingly obsolete formats. And I think you could make a reasonable argument under Section 108C that digitizing for preservation from microform or microfiche would be permissible under Section 108C. There just aren't that many institutions that still have those machines out there. Obviously, y'all are working more with microform and microfilm machines than I am these days. But I would, as a lawyer, I think that's a decent argument. Interlibrary loan. Certainly, the libraries on the call are well aware of that. That's a 108 exemption. patron-made copies. This is a wonderful exemption. Someone comes into your institution and they snap a picture with their cell phone, or they feed quarters into your copier or your scanner, and you aren't supervising it, then you are off the hook for any copyright violation, provided that somewhere you have posted above the machines or on the sign-in that they are responsible for complying with copyright. And the final exception is that in the last 20 years of copyright, libraries and archives can make copies of things that are not just orphan works, but works that are not currently being commercially exploited. So that if you're digitizing a newspaper that is not no longer in production or that doesn't have currently doesn't have an accessible archive in those last 20 years of copyright, you are free both to preserve it and to provide access to it, provided you're not actually, I think you are allowed even to charge for it, provided you're a nonprofit and you're putting it back into your revolving fund for that. Where things don't fall into 108, so that, for example, if you want to make your digital copies available off premises, then you're kicked back into fair use. And the idea is, again, that preservation is also a transformational use, and that preserving something has no market effect. So if you are preserving a newspaper that for some reason does not come under 108, then your backup is fair use. So going back to risk assessment, because ultimately it's all about the risk. The more access you provide, the higher the risk. Starting with a dark archive, but that's not what we're about. Pure preservation. If you're going to take something and you're going to lock it away until the newspapers dissolve, and then you're going to start using it, then you've got a dark archive. If you're limiting it to people who come to your buildings, so it's premises only. And then you start going up through researcher copies. If you have something that becomes a virtual reading room so that you have to click through a terms of service to access it, that's the passworded server. If you're just putting it on your website in the open web, that's a higher risk. And the highest risk of all is if you're selling, come to the library and we will sell you copies of the newspaper on the day of your birth. There's a commercial exploitation. That's going to be the highest risk. And we end really with the decision tree, which kind of summarizes everything I've said. Do you own it, or do you have permission for it? Is it protected by copyright? Is there an exemption? Can you get permission? And even if you say no to all of these questions, is it a level of risk that's acceptable to your institution? And that's what I got. A few resources. National digital newspaper programs guidelines have just lots of information. I would absolutely point you to that website. Association of Research Libraries has done a code of best practices for fair use for academic and research libraries. The Orphan Works, when they talk about libraries, archives, and other memory institutions, it's a very, very broad definition of orphan works. So their idea is that if you have a collection that has a substantial number of orphan works in it, you don't even have to prove it's all orphan works. They believe that these standards apply. And somewhat more conservative approach is from Society of American Archivists on orphan works, and when they talk about their best practices, it's for how to conduct a search and when you stop looking. So major information dump. I look forward to your questions. You're doing incredibly important work, and I'm so privileged to have talked to you. And over to Nicole.
Thank you. So Hope just gave us a great overview of copyright. And she mentioned, so you're thinking, you might be thinking, okay, so how do I actually figure out if things are in copyright? She mentioned doing that research. So that's what I'm going to talk about right now, is how we at the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project check to see if both our newspapers and then third-party content is under copyright. And so our process was actually developed based on information that Hope has shared, as well as what our fellow NDNP awardees are doing. And so I'm just sharing our process to illustrate a way that you could do this. We are not recommending that you follow our process. We are not saying if you follow our process, you are for sure going to make sure that all your stuff is clear and free of copyright. We're not making any legal guarantees. We're not giving any legal advice. I just have to state that the state library is not giving legal advice, but I am showing you how we do it. So like Hope said, it's complex looking at the copyright registration status of items. I've tried to break it down into a 4-step process, and I will admit it's not quite as linear as I've laid it out here. You do kind of do a lot of back and forth between things, and I'm going to describe what we do very quickly. It's not going to be super in-depth for the sake of time because we want to make sure there's enough time for questions. So if at the end of this, you're like, okay, I still don't get what you guys do, you can feel free to email me and we can discuss it in more detail as far as like what we actually do. Again, I will not be making recommendations, just explaining what we do. So the first step is going to be to create your documents. You're going to be pulling information from your newspapers and then looking up information, and you need a place for all that information to live, right? We're information, a lot of us are information professionals, or we deal with a lot of information, so we know how that is. We like to use a spreadsheet for this, but use what works best for you. If a Word document is better for you, that's totally fine. I do recommend having a document when you're researching the copyright of the newspaper title itself versus copyright of third-party content, because they're not completely different. It's not completely different processes, but you're recording things slightly differently. So for me personally, it helps to have those in separate documents. I'm going to show you, and just on the next slides, like examples of our spreadsheets, but just really quickly, I've listed here what are the types of fields or columns you might have. So for your newspaper titles, you're going to have a column for the years that you're digitizing. You're going to have a column that's going to have your search terms that you're going to search, and you'll pull your search terms mainly from the newspaper title, the publisher, maybe things like the location, or if there's any sort of organizational affiliation with the newspaper, such as like a labor union or another group that was involved with the paper. Those are going to kind of be your search terms. You're going to want a field for registration and renewal statuses. Yes or no, was it registered and renewed? And then you might also want fields for where you checked in the, what I call the CCE books, or the catalog of copyright entries. And we'll talk more about those in just a minute. And you might actually need more than one field for where you've checked in the CCE books, because sometimes those books are multi-sectional, so you check in more than one place. So that's what you might want in your newspaper title spreadsheet, and I'll show you a screenshot in just a second of that. For your third-party content spreadsheet, your fields might be a little bit different. We put the newspaper title, the publisher, and then we put the issue date, the specific date of an issue that we're looking at, the page number where we found the item, what type of content is it? Is it a comic, an ad, an article, a story, who the creator was? So that could be author, that could be illustrator. It's going to be different based on the content, but who made it? That could be an individual or a company. The title, so obviously for like a comic, an article, a story, you're going to have a clear title. For an advertisement, I usually go with the tagline, whatever the tagline of the ad is. Who was the copyright registrant? The registration status and renewal status, and then again, where you checked in the CCE book. So here is what that might look like for your newspaper. So as you'll see over here on the left-hand side, we've listed the years that we're doing, and there's multiple listings for a year because we're doing multiple search terms per year. So this spreadsheet is for the Bradley Beam, which is a newspaper that we're digitizing in this grant cycle. Fun little paper. Excuse me. So in that second column, you see we pulled our search terms are from the title of the newspaper as well as where it's located. We use that for our search terms. We also have a column to put a direct link to which CCE books we checked. You don't have to have that in there if you don't want to. That's just something we tried out with this spreadsheet for this cycle. Then you see we've got our column. Was it registered, yes or no? And we determined, was it registered, yes or no? Where you see part 1, 2, 3, 4 in the index. That's everywhere in the CCE book that we checked for the registration. Things are listed alphabetically in the different parts. So we went through and looked in alphabetically in those pages, and that's where we recorded that. Then renewals, the same sort of setup. There's just one spot to check in the renewals, though you don't have as many sections. And you'll see we went 28 years later to check those renewals. And I'm going to talk more about that search process in just a minute. Here's what our spreadsheet looks like for our third-party content checks, and it's cut in half so that I could fit it here on the slide. So on this first side, we list the newspaper title and the publisher, and then the issue date for where the content came from, the page number where the content was, what type of content it is, the creator, the title, who was the copyright registrant. You'll see that next to the copyright symbol on the page. Was it registered? And then we go down, which actually is over in our spreadsheet. Was it renewed? Then instead of putting the links for the CCE books in this spreadsheet, I make columns for each book and then record my search results in those columns. So as you can see, I was searching by the creator name or by the copyright registrant name. Those are the search terms that I use, and I listed the pages where I was looking for those terms. So those just it's a sample layout of our two different spreadsheets. And this slide deck is going to go out in the follow-up email, so you'll be able to look at this more closely in case it's not large enough on your screen. All right, so you created that spreadsheet. You've got those fields in there. Now you are going to start populating those fields by gathering the information from your newspapers. So like I said, for your title research, you obviously need to know the title of your newspaper. That's going to probably be your search, go in that search terms field. Your publisher might also go in the search terms field, as well as other affiliations like a labor union or the location of the paper. You put all those in your search term. And then the years that you want to check are going to go in your years field. You want to check every year that's pre-1964, post right now, 1926, as of next year, 1927, every year that you're wanting to digitize. You can't just check some years. You need to check the copyright status for all years of a paper that you're trying to digitize. For third-party content, you're going to have to decide on what technique you're going to use, because it's not necessarily feasible to check every single third-party item in every single newspaper issue that you're going to digitize, especially if you're looking at a newspaper that was published daily. So we use at CDMP, we use a sampling technique. And so for what we do for every year that we're going to digitize, we pick a certain number of issues and we decide on that number based on, was this a daily paper? Was it a weekly paper? So it does change. We don't always have a set number. We alternate between different numbers based on information about the paper. So you pick so many issues that you're going to sample from, and for those issues, you review every single page in that issue, and you look for any third-party items, and those are going to have a copyright notice on them. And so in addition to just the basic information about the newspaper, you know, the title, the publisher, you also need to record in your spreadsheet the date of the issue, the type of content, the creator, the title, the copyright registrant, which you're going to pull directly from the item itself. And that is, you want to make sure you are accurate in what you're recording from the newspaper about your third-party items, because that's going to help you later in your searching. So you gather all that information. You've partially populated your spreadsheet. Your next step is that you're going to use that information to research the copyright status of your newspapers and your third-party content. So you're going to need to use the catalogs of copyright entries to do these checks. We access them here at this link, which again will be in the follow-up, in the slide deck in the follow-up email. So UPenn has gathered all the different digitized versions of the catalogs of copyright entries, because they've been digitized across several different institutions. UPenn has got a landing page that they've created. The library has created this landing page so that you can easily find the books by year to use them for your copyright checks. So to get started, you're looking up your initial registration. When you get to the landing page, just going to go back for a second. This is actually what you're going to see at the top of the page. And when you're looking up your initial registration, you're going to go to this section, look up records by year, and say you're checking for a newspaper or an item, third-party content item from 1942. So you'll click 1942. And then under 1942, you're going to see a list like I've got here in the middle of the screen. So if you're looking up just the copyright of your newspaper, you're going to click periodicals. Here it's part 2. It may not be part 2 for every year. Sometimes they did change the organizations of the book. This is not what you're going to see for every single year. This is just what it looks like for 1942. So be aware, sometimes things look slightly different because certain years the books just look different. If you're looking up your initial registration, copyright registration for third-party content, you need to go to the section that includes pamphlets, contributions to periodicals, which is the second one on this list. Okay, so you're going to go to one of those. You're going to click one of those links. That is going to take you to the digital file of the CCE book. So you got 2 different ways you can search once you open up that digital file. There should be a text search box. You can enter your text there, hit search. That's going to run a search of the OCR, the optical character recognition that was done on that digitized file, which what that does is it reads all the text and makes it so that you can search it, which you can't do in just an image file. So you can run a search with your text box like you do in a Google search. And you can also browse through the book itself. We use a combination of both. We run text searches and then we scroll through the book. Like I said, the content is listed alphabetically in these books. So we scroll through and look for our search terms where they would fall in the book. So remember, for your newspaper, for your title research, you're going to be looking up your newspaper title and your publisher in the relevant years that you're digitizing. And then for your third-party content, you're going to want to be searching the books for creator and copyright registrant and potentially also the title of the piece. And so run your searches with your search terms and then record what you find in your spreadsheet. So you're either going to say, I looked at this page, notate the page number, but you didn't see anything, or you found something and you're going to record the information that you found. So what is this going to look like? Here is a page from one of the periodical sections of the CCE catalogs. As you can see, you got a lot of tight font there. So what the unindented is, this designates that this is a new entry here in the catalog. Typically here at the top, you're going to see, your creator or your copyright registrant, maybe a title, depending on how they registered it. And then underneath is going to be the registration information, which is going to include dates, if there's something like volume or issue numbers, and then your copyright registration numbers. So you want to record this information in your spreadsheet as well, if you do find it. You may not find it in here. And so then you didn't find anything, but you notate what page, you notate your page number. Actually, the page number that there's also a page number at the bottom, and you'll see that it's 2 different page numbers at the top and the bottom, which is cut off in this screenshot. Just pick one and always use those page numbers. So that's what you're going to see when you're looking up your initial registrations. Then you need to look at renewals. So you'll go back to this main page, and you're going to, this in the screenshot here, this is the main page. You actually scroll down on that page to the section labeled 1950 through 1977 with renewals of copyright from 1922 to, to what's the year there? Sorry, 1950. And you're going to find the year, it lists out years, and you're going to click the year that is 28 years after your initial registration. For our third-party content, we actually don't just look at 28 years after, we also check year 27 and 29, because third-party content, if it was registered separately, was obviously not necessarily registered at the same time as the newspaper because it was registered by somebody else. So sometimes third-party content was registered a little before it was published or a little after if it was published later in the year. So we actually check that 3-year time period for third-party content to be extra safe. We like to double check things. So for your initial title, for the newspaper title though, when you're checking renewals, we just do 28 years after that initial registration. And then for third-party content, we look at the 3-year time span. So you'll click one of those years on the page, there will be a list there. And then you will scroll down on the page that it takes you to, and you're going to have a section here, like in this image here on the slide, books and contributions to periodicals, and usually directly under it, there's also a periodicals section. So depending on whether you're checking the renewal for the newspaper or for the third-party content is going to determine which section you're clicking. So if you're looking for newspapers, you're going to go to this periodicals section, and you'll specifically click renewals. You see how you see renewals right here? This is not the periodical section, but it'll look slightly similar. If you're looking for your third-party content, you're going to come to this books and contributions to periodicals section, and you see there's 2 books, and you want to make sure you click renewals. Because these books have more than just the renewals in them, and you only are wanting to look at the renewals. For the renewals books, we recommend, or I recommend, browsing, not using the text box to search, because as you can see, there's a lot of pages in these books, and it's not just the renewals, and your search results will be across the entire book, and you really only want it from this like subset of pages. So it's alphabetical. So scroll down to where your search terms would appear, see if they're there in the book. I'm going to show you a page in just a minute. And the books are typically split half of the year in one book, half of the year in the other book. So make sure you check both and record your results in the spreadsheet again. And this is kind of what the book is going to look like. So you see this is like an A page, and it's got the copyright holder listed, and everything they had registered is under them. So and this is actually for books, it looks like. So you'll scroll through the pages and look by your search terms, and again, record in your spreadsheet your findings. If you didn't find anything, you just notate the pages. You can notate the pages you looked at. If you did find something, say this Abraham Joseph is your search result, you're going to record the information that you see here in the search result in your spreadsheet. All right, so you've got all your information. You ran your searches. So the next thing you want to do is you want to review your results. For your title research, you go back and look. Was copyright renewed or no? You got Hope's decision tree that gives really good next steps for digitizing. You'll seek permission if necessary. Okay, for your third-party content, again, you're going to go back and look at your results. Did any of your items have the copyright renewed or no? Again, Hope's got that great decision tree. You're going to do your risk assessment, because sometimes you are going to come across items that were renewed and are still under copyright, and you have to decide if you're willing to take the risk. Hope mentioned, technically you really only need to look at the renewals. At the State Library, we do look for registration and renewals. We look for both just to be totally sure. Because again, if something is under copyright, we're taking on that risk. If it's a minimal risk, if we feel like it's a minimal enough risk. So we just want to make sure that we know for sure. So that's a very, very quick and dirty of copyright research. It can feel daunting because these books that you're looking in are very large, but just, it's important research, because you want to make sure that, copyright is clear. And if it's not clear, you want to be aware of the risk that you're taking and make sure your organization is comfortable with that. And like Hope said, I mean, the risk is oftentimes, as long as it's not, something really high risk, it's worth taking, because we want to make the material available. Really quickly, we have a couple more webinars coming up in our series. This slide deck will go out, so have that information, and they'll be up on the CLHO website as well. If you have any questions about the process that we use to research copyright at CDMP, feel free to reach out to me. Or if you just have any questions about what we discussed today, what we discussed in last week's session, what we are discussing in future webinars, and then a couple more resources in addition to the great ones that Hope shared. This is our page at the State Library that we have on digitizing newspapers. There is a page on copyright, and it probably has some of the same links that Hope shared. And then here is the online books page where we go to find all the catalogs of copyright entry. So that's it for me. I know that was really fast and that it's not necessarily a simple process, but I just wanted to give you folks a quick rundown, show you how you could set up your spreadsheets, and then the place that we go to find the books where we're actually doing the research. So now we have time for questions for myself or Hope. Oh, the first question I actually see from Barb, and I'll address that. How did the Library of Congress decide which newspapers to include in Chronicling America? They didn't. The people who get awarded the National Digital Newspaper Program grants, each state, so like Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project, each state has a selection process, and we have an advisory board, and every time you're awarded the grant, you work with the advisory board to select newspapers and which years of those papers. And NEH, who is the funder of NDNP and the Library of Congress, they have some guidelines that they like us to follow for selection. And so we follow those guidelines and make selections every grant. Oh, wondering why the Norwich Bulletin was included, but not the day. So that was that paper, the digitization of that paper happened before I was on the project, but basically the advisory board, we follow the selection criteria laid out by Library of Congress and NEH, but then we also have to look at things like the quality of the microfilm that we're going to be using, the availability of the microfilm, copyright status, things like that, because in the beginning of NDNP, we actually were not allowed to digitize things that were not in the public domain. That's changed over the course of the grant project, because this grant project's been around for a while now. And as copyright research has advanced in relation to historic newspapers, we're doing more and more. And so that was just a choice that we made, at the time in that grant cycle. And then yes, everything that we do as part of NDNP has to be digitized from microfilm. So those were digitized from microfilm. And I can't say off the top of my head who owns that film, if that's film that the state library has, or if we had to borrow it from somewhere else. But yes, so now for more questions. And you can type in the chat, or you can take yourself off of mute.
Yeah, great. I'll bring us into gallery view. So if anybody has a question, you can raise your hand. Like using the reactions is the best way to make sure I see that you've raised your hand, but we're definitely available to take some questions live now, since I'm not seeing a big pile up in the chat. Although you're welcome to put them in the chat as well.
Come on, I know you guys are. Well, I mean, Nicole is good, but she must have questions.
Okay, I have a question. I'm Ingrid Wood, and I am the town historian in Columbia. We have an archive. Basically, it's closed to the public except for me and a few people at my permission. We have about 40 years of scrapbooks of newspaper clippings that were written by a journalist from Columbia. She clipped every single article that she ever wrote, put these in loads of scrapbooks that are deteriorating. I would love to digitize them. She worked for many, many newspapers throughout New England and New York. And so I am, and this collection starts from about 1940 and ends in 1975. So my question is, can I digitize them without going through this arduous process of checking the copyright for every single article?
Should I take that one? Yep. Okay. First of all, is she still with us, or can you get permission from her family?
She's deceased. There is one family member still in the area.
Get permission from them. And
then what?
Then you have wonderful cover, because because you've got a situation where you have permission from the author, and there's probably, I don't know if she worked for these newspapers or if she was a freelancer for these newspapers, but so technically you'd have to go newspaper to newspaper. But I think the argument, you've got her permission, she's local, You're probably, do you have a website, or are you simply digitizing these for preservation?
For preservation.
Zero risk.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely zero risk.
And if I
Because
can chime in there,
because
like the
it's
story,
fair use. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
the
it's a story.
story is
It's
not the
transformational.
newspapers. The story is the woman.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I mean, like what you're digitizing, what you're
Yeah.
trying to capture and preserve there has, I mean, newspapers were her career, but this is a collection of her works across, I mean, the story is about her and her life. So that's why I would sort of echo what Hope has said. Like, I mean, that just seems wonderful. And I do hope you make them available to a researching public, because what a wonderful story about, a woman, a journalist, at this moment in the mid 20th century. I mean, like, that's a really wonderful story. And do you have other materials relating to her life? Because that would just be like, I mean, really fabulous.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Ingrid, I would recommend in terms of digitization, if the items are not already falling out of the scrapbook, do not try to remove them. Digitize the scrapbooks pages themselves.
Absolutely.
And then you can go in later and do cropping, editing for single articles, but don't damage the material trying to take it out for digitization if you don't have to.
Absolutely, because the way that she compiled it, the way she pulled it together is part of the story. I don't know if they're purely chronological. I know we have a lot of scrapbooks, but it tends to be an actor who put in a scrapbook of their reviews, and we fully make those available. Why did they save them? This is part of their story. It's not the story of the newspapers.
Thank you.
Hope, there's another good question here that I think is going to be good for you. How do the newspaper, like the organization themselves, seeking to digitize their own archives, handle copyright issues for third-party content? Is it different for them since they published the third-party content originally?
Yes, they have the compilation copyright.
Okay.
The compilation copyright is different. They presumably, if they didn't have permission to do this stuff originally, then it may be a different argument. But by and large, as long as they're doing the whole thing, they're going to be fine.
So they're already covered then.
They're covered. That is the National Geographic case.
Okay. All right, great. This next question is for us at CSL. What is CSL doing, Connecticut State Library doing to identify and preserve long ceased publication local newspapers, often in the hands of local historical societies or libraries? That's a tough question. I will say I can't speak just for CSL because I only work on this grant project. Anna Newman is here. She's the co-director of CDMP, but she's also the digital projects manager at the Connecticut State Library. So I'm going to let her weigh in. This might be a question too that we might have to get back to someone offline. I don't know if we have a perfect answer for today.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I can do is maybe provide a little bit of history of what the library has done in the past. So back in the 90s, there was a project called the Connecticut Newspaper Project. So that was kind of the precursor to the Digitization project. And this was a nationwide effort with funding, I think, from Library of Congress or National Endowment for the Humanities. And this was a project to actually go and identify what newspapers were held in institutions throughout the state. And all of that information, so this included historical societies, it included public libraries. And all of the data that they gathered is now accessible in the Library of Congress's directory of U.S. newspapers and libraries or something like that. I can't remember the exact title.
They changed the
offhand.
name.
Yeah, they've changed the name. So, but the Library of Congress has their database of all of the newspapers. You can actually see what newspapers are held in what institutions at the time that the data was gathered. Since then, we've had, staffing cuts and different changes in the organization. So we don't really have the resources to kind of continue doing that kind of work. But that effort was from the 90s, does have some information. So we aren't really able right now to be able to kind of actively go out and preserve those things. So I hope that helps. But if you want to follow up with us, we can, about specific questions, we're happy to answer them or get you answers.
And if I could jump in there, I mean, like if there's a role that the league can play, if you're looking to identify collections that are out there, I mean, these webinars are one way of kind of, bringing together a group of people. I think this was Connecticut Humanities' intention behind this, because there was so much interest in digitizing runs of newspapers that we saw in some grant rounds, that, you know, like if we can help gather that information, if that's information that the state library is interested in, you know, finding out what runs are at what places, you know, that's a role that we can play.
Definitely possibilities, I think, for a future collaboration on that. But yes, if you have any further questions about that, feel free to email me, and Anna and I will get in touch if there are further questions about kind of what has been done in the past. And, you know, another question that I think is good for Hope, someone asked, so to digitize newspaper articles about your library from various newspapers, is that allowed? Like digitizing?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Alright.
There's not gonna be a lot of risk there.
Okay, so that's all the questions that we have so far in the chat. Or anybody else would like to ask a question live or in the chat? Nope, here we go. How about subject-specific periodicals, school newspapers, local club newspapers, military/veterans newspapers? What, Hope, do you have to follow kind of the same protocols with those?
Well, it's the same protocols. In fact, some of the most amazing things, I don't know how much Connecticut has done this. My recollection is you have done some. Aren't newspapers. They're union newspapers. I don't think most places have school newspapers. A lot of school and universities have done their own newspaper runs. But foreign language newspapers from immigrant communities, Black newspapers from times when the major, you know, mainstream media was not covering Black issues. The moose newspapers, the church newspapers. Gosh, we have you know, this is a side thing. We've got this amazing collection of local cookbooks, the Ladies Auxiliary cookbooks on veterans organizations. Those are all things that, and speaking for the National Digital Newspaper project, are very important. Very important. God, we've got a collection at the Library of Congress of the newspapers that were created in the Japanese concentration camps, or the Japanese internment camps rather. And it's just brilliant, important historic stuff we should be saving.
Do some of the, now Hope, some papers like a school newspaper or like a local club's paper, would those have typically had their copyright registered?
Nah.
No, okay.
No,
So
they weren't going to be registered, and most of the time, I mean, I'm trying to remember. We did print ours, but a lot of club newspapers, if you're old as I am, you may remember them being mimeoed. Okay, so, yes, so that, and God, Lord knows those rotted and faded away years ago.
So best practice in that case, if an organization has papers like that were not registered under copyright, if whoever created them, if that organization still exists, it would be, you know, good to make contact and say, we want to digitize these papers, right? Yeah. So you wouldn't necessarily have to get permission per se, but it would be good to.
You don't pre-64, but context is everything, and that's what we do as memory institutions. You want to know what's going on, why this was created, why this splinter publication happened.
Exactly.
And that story, a lot of times the story is more important than the actual context. People are history.
So we have, and as part of Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project, as part of NDNP, we have done some subject specific papers, like Hope mentioned foreign language papers. We've done the African American papers that still exist on microfilm from Connecticut. And we run a copyright check on all those papers, just like we do for the, you know, just local papers. So, yeah. And we do, well, I will say for NDNP though, we do have to follow the strict definition of what is considered a periodical. And so there will sometimes be some things that people may consider newspapers, but they're technically newsletters or something of that. And then we cannot do those for NDNP, but other organizations are free to digitize. They don't have to follow those guidelines that we have to follow. So some of that other great stuff that Hope mentioned, you know, is also really valuable resources to be digitized.
Yeah,
do we-
we are only one grants program.
Yes.
And
yes.
I don't know if the Humanities Council would be interested in funding some of the smaller organizations.
Yeah, so CT Humanities, for those of you who are not aware or haven't been to the other sessions, they do have operating fund grants. We'll have them speak about those in our next webinar, actually. And those grants can be used. I don't know, Mike, I don't think is here anymore. I think he had to leave, Mike from CT Humanities. But CT Humanities does have a grant available that could be used for digitization. So, and they'll speak about that more on October 6th at our webinar there. Do we have any other, I didn't miss any questions in the chat, did I?
Hope, I actually have a question for you, since we don't have questions in the chat. On your risk management slide, when you were talking about that, and you were saying, you know, like there's always going to be kind of some level of risk. And one of the things that you had pointed out was that some of the content might be restricted by licensing on your microfilm or digital copies. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's something that has maybe come up in other conversations, might be helpful for people to know more about.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. The problem is that contracts trump copyright under our law. So if you buy microfilm that's subject to a contractual restriction, then you must comply with the contract, even though it's something that's public domain. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
So then you have to,
So
you have to get permission from whoever microfilmed it, if they still exist, and if they
Yeah.
don't still exist, again, only if it's the contract. If you hired someone to microfilm it for you, then it's probably going to be okay, depending on what your long ago predecessors agreed to when they did the microfilming.
and this relates to the
But if you
webinar
buy-
we
but if you-
did.
But if you buy commercial microfilm, it may be
Yeah.
more of a problem.
And this relates to the webinar we did last week, where we talked about how you're finding the materials that you're going to digitize. So if you are digitizing from microfilm, and remember, you're looking for those masters to use, and you had to get them from a company that owns them. And like Hope was saying, remember, when you purchase masters from a company, they're going to have a purchase agreement. And but in Connecticut, there are a lot of newspapers that were microfilmed as part of the Connecticut newspaper project. And then a lot of local organizations, libraries have done their own microfilming as well. So in those cases, you're going to be reaching out to whoever had the microfilm created, whether it be the state library or a local library or other organization. You're going to be reaching out to them and asking, one, do you have the masters that we can borrow to digitize from, the master microfilm, the original microfilm that was in the camera when the items were microfilmed? And then two, can we use that microfilm for digitization? Do we have your permission to digitize that microfilm? And so that's kind of where that comes from. And the video of that webinar is available on the CLHO YouTube, if anybody needs to go back and reference that. And if you have additional questions about locating microfilm, using microfilm for digitization, just reach out to me.
But it's another situation. The microfilm producers know that microfilm is an increasingly obsolete. They may be willing to let you do it in exchange for getting a copy of the scan.
Exactly. Yeah. So just, have that again, that goes back to do your due diligence and contact, these people, and just, have that conversation with them. Tell them, obviously you're a library, you're a historical society, and archive, you're likely a nonprofit or a government entity. You're not looking to make money off of this. You're trying to preserve it and make it more publicly accessible, because the microfilm is no longer a good means of accessibility for historic newspapers. So, just have those conversations. And again, if any questions about any of that, feel free to reach out to me. This is what we do. I do newspaper. That's what I do all day, every day, is I'm doing newspaper digitization. I'm working with microfilm. So yeah, happy to talk about it more. All right. Do we have any other questions? It's looking like no.
Okay, 7 minutes of lifespan back for all of us. And thank you so much. I really appreciated chatting with you guys. Thank you. Thank you. For
Thank
the
you so much,
invitation.
Hope.
Yeah, well, thank you to all our presenters, Hope, Nicole, Anna. It was great to have you with us. And thanks to all of you for being here. I hope you learned a lot and feel a little bit more confident about, thinking about what your level of risk is. I side with Hope that, like, erring on the side of access is usually a pretty good idea, because that's a part of our mission as, as history organizations. So thanks to all of you for all the great work you're doing out there in your communities. Nicole and Anna, and I think Hope, are people available to, could people reach out to contact you if they have follow-up questions?
Yeah, put in here. And actually I have a follow-up fact because
okay, great.
I didn't realize that that NDNP was limited to digitization from microfilm. It's not. They're just,
what?
There are special markup rules for digitization for print, which should be in the link that I gave you, but you can jump straight to digitization from print.
Yes, but I mean,
it's easier for microfilm and a lot cheaper, and a lot cheaper.
For awardees who are participating in NDNP, yes, we have to follow their guidelines. Anybody else who's digitizing, you can digitize from print, you can digitize from microfilm. You're not limited in any way. But here at CDNP, we follow the NDNP guidelines, and primarily from microfilm. We at CDNP have not chosen to do any print digitization. We haven't had the need to, I guess I should say.
Yeah, but I know we have a newspaper page size scanner in our serials division. So y'all can come down here and digitize.
Yeah, just go down to DC.
Go down to Virginia.
It's actually the scanner, unlike the copier, is free because there's no paper involved.
There you go.
So come to DC.
That fact is sort of, is interesting. It goes back, I think, to sort of Fielding's question earlier about, like, what is kind of out there in the field that we may not know about at the Connecticut State Library level. And that, to me, it should be, an encouragement to all of you at your smaller institutions, that you may be sitting on a really fabulous local resource that, is not going to be captured because of these rules or guidelines or, a priority list, an ease of digitization list, that it's not going to be captured necessarily right away through the digital newspaper projects, and that you have a really important part to play in making those local periodicals and newsletters, things that we were talking about, like club newsletters. Maybe there is an active, organization in your community, and you have all their mimeograph newsletters for like 2 decades. Those are really valuable. I can speak as a historian and a researcher. Those are incredibly valuable. I wrote my dissertation on 4-H clubs. I was always looking at that stuff, right? 4-H club newsletters from Montana, like tiny town, this sort of thing. It's almost ephemera that doesn't always get saved. So when you have it, it's really unique. And so I think that's an argument and should be an encouragement for all of you to feel pretty confident. And it's out, and for those sorts of things, you don't really have to worry so much about the copyright at all, right? It's not really an issue. You can go ahead and digitize it and make it available, and that's a pretty low risk endeavor. So I take that as a great encouragement to all of you to go out and do great things. And we hope to see you at future webinars in this series. Thank you so much for being here today.